So this panel is going to be on peer prediction, which is an academic field that looks at sort of incentivizing crowdsourcing, which is of course highly relevant to Kleros. Our title is Unlocking Trust, Peer Prediction and Blockchain-Based Dispute Resolution. So it's, I'm going to continue talking as part of the panel, but then also we have Ian Kash and Goel. So do you want to introduce yourself briefly before I sort of jump into the my part of the intro?
Sure. I'm in the computer science department at the University of Illinois Chicago, and I work on a lot of different things at the interface between computer science and economics, including peer prediction and related things.
I'm Naman Goel. I'm a researcher also in the computer science department at University of Oxford. And I work on decentralized systems, more from a systems perspective, and AI systems. During my PhD, I also worked on game theory and incentive mechanism design for decentralized systems. And I'll be talking about some of that previous work that I did during my PhD.
Cool. So the format for the panels is generally going to be that each panelist will make like a small intro presentation, and then we'll have open discussion, audience questions. We'll ask each other questions. I'll start with this panel. So recall, my background is as a mathematician. I've come from peer prediction as kind of like an outsider. So I look forward to hearing the points of view of people who grew up more in this space and are more natives to peer prediction. But I really came to this from trying to think about class. And generally, the core idea that panelists will probably expand on is that in peer prediction, you not only you want the system to be able to produce answers to some questions, and you don't only ask people what is the right answer to the question. You ask them to predict how the other people who are responding to the question will vote, so that who's right, Alice versus Bob, and not only that, but what percentage of people will vote for Alice, what percentage of people will vote for Bob. And the thing is, you can do stuff with this extra information that can complement usually the incentive scheme that people have, maybe how you aggregate the votes together, but usually the sort of payoff structure for your participants. And a classic example is the sort of thought experiment where they ask, I think this example due to Prelic, what is the capital of the US state of Pennsylvania? And you ask people, okay, what's the capital? And you also ask me, what do you think, what will other people say the capital is? And the thing is that Pennsylvania has a, it's almost a trick question if you don't know the answer, because people who don't know the answer will generally think it's Philadelphia, which is this old historic city that makes sense to be a capital, but that's not the capital. The capital is Harrisburg. So people who know the answer is Harrisburg will think that other people will think the answer is Philadelphia. So you can pick out from this sort of dynamic of the votes and the predictions that, there's something going on. There's this informed minority here that seems to be telling me that there's an asymmetry between Philadelphia and Harrisburg that looks like what would happen if you have some group of experts that realize the actual answer is Harrisburg. And people say that Harrisburg is surprisingly popular. And then the issue when doing this in a decentralized environment is that you can pretend to be an informed minority, and you only need a minority of the votes to do that. What if my attacker says that they vote Pittsburgh, and they say the other people are going to say Harrisburg? Harrisburg is the trap answer. The real answer is Pittsburgh. How many votes do they need to manipulate the system? The peer prediction mechanisms have different assumptions on collusion and attacking peer systems having multiple votes. Each mechanism has its own attack model. And in a blockchain environment where you really have to worry about attacks, it's limiting. Many of the cool mechanisms that people do before don't work because you have these kinds of effects. How can you come up with a mechanism that is, still uses the advantages of peer prediction, that gleans information from these predictions that people are making in addition to their votes, while at the same time is really robust to attacks? How do you do that? And there's a second point I have here that makes it about the challenges of peer prediction in a centralized environment, where in Kleros, the amounts that are at stake, the amounts that jurors can be paid, the amounts that can be ruled between the parties, they're all things that are put in as deposits in advance, like they're held by a smart contract, so that when the jury rules for Bob, like the funds will go automatically to Bob. Like Kleros can self-execute, automatically execute, based on how the smart contract works, but it can only move around money that it already has. And generally, we have sort of a model where like every amount of money that can be moved around has to be locked on the platform in advance. That is at least general limitation of like systems that are really decentralized and don't have good identity. You can't sue somebody off chain to like get the money recovered. So that also is somewhat of a limitation, that I can't like have unlimited penalties on people. So just to like briefly talk about how maybe I've been thinking about peer prediction in Kleros. So I mean, Kleros is already kind of like a peer prediction. Like, I mean, you don't predict how other people are going to vote, but there's this like notion of keeping in mind how they're going to vote that's implicit in the Schelling point system, where like I don't, like so far our mechanisms don't ask you to predict that, but like it should be in the back of your mind. So there's already relations. And one mechanism that I've been thinking about is to handle a problem that we have observed in Kleros as it exists. And in some cases, the answers are really predictable. Like imagine you have a type of case between freelancers and small businesses, and the freelancers win 97% of the time. Then it's, one could ask, well, what if I just always vote for the freelancer? Will that be a profitable thing to do? And our historic way of dealing with this is to tweak our parameters to disincentivize that, where we have our sort of fee parameter, our deposit parameter, and you like crank up the deposit parameter so that it's like, okay, like sure, you win 97% of the time by voting for the freelancer, but that 3% of the time that you're wrong, if you just randomly vote for this freelancer, you just get burned. You lose a huge deposit, so that the difference between being right 97% of the time when you just always vote for the freelancer and being right 99% of the time when you like actually take the effort to like look at the case and decide who's right or wrong is the difference between being profitable and being non-profitable. And that's great and all, but it results in like really large deposits, which have like, if you have risk-averse participants, can lead to user experience problems. An idea that I've been sort of thinking about, these are half-formed ideas, there's further research to be done, is to use a mechanism where you basically, like it's designed around trying to reduce this issue of risk aversion in deposits, and your payoff is broken into an information score and a prediction score, similar to a lot of prediction mechanisms. You produce like a vote, and then also a prediction for how other people are going to vote. The thing that like penalizes you or rewards you based on how your prediction scores is a common mechanism. You use like a scoring rule, whatever. But then for the information score that determines how you penalize the rewards you based on what your actual vote is. If you're right, you get a flat fee, and if you're wrong, your deposit is scaled by the average percentage of people who vote for the option you voted for. So that basically, if let's see, so if you vote for Alice and people, like the other peers, think that like 99% of people would vote for Bob, and you're like the rare person who voted for Alice, then you're really penalized. Whereas if you vote for Alice and the other jurors think, okay, yeah, Bob won, but like it's like 60-40, then you're not penalized so much. With the idea being that if you randomly vote, you're going to have you're going to be penalized both in the cases that are clear-cut and not clear-cut. But you're going to be like really penalized in the cases that are clear-cut, whereas the honest jurors are usually not going to be penalized in those cases. They're only going to be penalized in the fuzzy cases where the stakes are lower. So the deposits that people win or lose on average wind up not being so large. And if you compare this to sort of the default mechanism that just like gives you flat fee if you're right, flat like deposit if you're wrong, we have some very preliminary theorems, current work, future work, that say that assume academically rational, possibly with risk aversion, you have some kind of model for how likely you are to be able to resolve the task correctly. It's like exponential in the effort you make. You have like different levels of difficulty of the task. Some tasks are harder than others, more clear-cut than others, that have like curves that are shifted up or down. Then the default mechanism, the peer prediction mechanism, requires smaller average penalties on average. So it winds up being better for risk-averse participants. Like basically the stakes need to be lower. Like the average compensation winds up being the same, but both the fees and the penalties are closer together. Whereas for the default mechanism, you have like wildly different fees and penalties. Okay, so that's sort of my intro. Like now my panelists can describe sort of their ideas and like introduce their work, and then we'll have an open discussion.
Okay, so good. So that's kind of in some ways a nice lead into what I want to talk about. And this is based on some joint work with collaborators from the University of Colorado Boulder, Mary Monroe and Ref Frangillo. And the place I want to start is starting with that same decision that the juror was making, right? Which side of the case should be voted for at the end, right? So it's going to be a binary outcome. But kind of what I want to quibble with, kind of in the previous model, is like, what does the juror really know when making that voting decision, right? So a lot of modeling in the peer prediction world kind of assumes that what the kind of juror knows is the same thing that they're reporting. And I want to kind of argue that maybe that's not really true or appropriate in this setting, and that matters in important ways. And so I'm going to take a really stylized version of what does the juror know, and think of this as like the juror has some maybe just number in their head which reflects how strong the case is for each person, right? And so then I'm going to assume this is a kind of a continuum, which is like in our paper for technical convenience is not really essential to what we're doing, but just the key piece of our modeling is that people have this richer information than they're actually asked to eventually report. And when they finally make their report, they use some rule like, oh, if it's above some threshold, say 0, I'm going to vote for the customer. If it's below that threshold, if some negative number, I'm going to vote for the business, right? And that's so I have this richer information that I map into my actual thing, and this feels natural, right? Because there are all these detailed facts of the case they're supposed to read. They're not literally just reading a thing that says vote for the customer, right? There's this richness that has to be distilled into an impression. And so why does this matter? So like the standard thing of what's sometimes called output agreement, like the simplest peer prediction mechanism where you just get rewarded. This is just that payoff that like Kleros 1.0 uses of paying you if you match the answer of somebody else or not paying you if you don't match. Well, like if I'm getting rewarded for that, what's the decision I need to make strategically in order to decide how to vote? Well, if I think after reading the case that the company should win, in order to actually vote for the company, I had better believe that it's more likely that the other people are going to say the company should win as well, right? So my probabilistic belief after reading everything about what other people are going to do needs to incline me to vote honestly, right? But in sort of this richer world, I'm not kind of conditioning my belief just on the fact of who I think I'm going to win, but something about how strong their case is, right? So, okay, like I think of this, this case is a pretty strong case for the company. How likely do I think that other people are to say the company is going to win? It's probably pretty high. I'm probably going to be motivated honestly, right? So things sort of mostly seem to work in that sense. The tricky bit is what happens in kind of those very marginal cases that got brought up, when it's not so clear, where I think it's like very slightly in the favor of the customer, but I'm not sure. And now actually, like, what I should do strategically when I'm right on this margin is going to depend quite a lot on my exact model of, so we kind of talked about what other people are going to think and going to do. And so we look at just kind of a model, sort of a very simple stylized model where the information, like where do these real numbers come from? We come up with a simple model where there's some ground truth that's just a draw from a Gaussian, and then everyone has their own slightly noisy interpretation that's a draw from their own individualized Gaussian distribution. So there's some ground truth, and everyone has a noisy version of that that's what they perceive. And based on this, they can kind of infer probabilities of what other people are going to do. And if you kind of crank through this, you could say, well, okay, I'd arbitrarily set that at 0, but there's no reason the threshold for voting has to be at 0, right? It could be that, the system is and somehow, biased against the company, and the company needs to have a stronger case to win, right? There's nothing magic about 0 being it. So we could say, what if the threshold was at -2.5, right? Like, well, so if I think the threshold is there and I'm somebody right by that threshold, like I'm somebody who got the signal, -2.5, what should I do? Well, in order to, maybe I'm supposed to tie break in favor of the company at that point, it had better be the case that I think it's more likely that somebody else is going to get a signal that's also less than or equal to -2.5. Otherwise, I'm going to do the wrong thing. But actually in this Gaussian model, that's not going to happen. I'll think that because there's kind of this true thing and then my own noise on top of it, I'll think, well, probably other people on average are going to think the case is a little less strong than I do because I got a pretty strong signal. So I think actually other people are going to end up on the other side of this threshold. So since I'm kind of this marginal person, my incentives actually, even if on average people have the right incentives, these marginal people have the wrong incentives and are going to want to vote the wrong way. So actually that turns out it's not an equilibrium. Those marginal people are not going to vote the right way if that was the threshold. And you can try this with a bunch of other thresholds, and it turns out that like almost nothing works as a threshold. Almost nothing works as an equilibrium if you think about the incentives of these marginal people, except as it turns out exactly 0, and this comes from the symmetry of the Gaussians, and there you sort of think it's equally likely someone else is going to be on either side, so you're willing to report truthfully. So even though like if you look at the theory on output agreement, it says, oh yeah, all you need is like your signal to be more likely. But if you think of this richer space, that kind of breaks down. So there's a bunch more technical things that you could say about this that I think I'll kind of not delve into in the interest of time. I think kind of the key thing is, right, there's just this very finite set of thresholds you can end up setting. And note that based on the information structure, those thresholds kind of constrain like how likely various outcomes are. So like in this model I wrote down, the only threshold that can work in equilibrium is 50% of the cases go each way. And that may not be what you want, right? And when there's some like endogeneity about like where exactly it is, these kind of boundaries could drift over time, and you should worry about kind of the system drifting away from the intended point based on the incentive. And in this case, it could actually drift towards the kind of lazy equilibrium, not because people are lazy, but because that's actually what their incentives cause them to do. There's kind of a vicious cycle where people are kind of moved more and more towards kind of those extreme lazy things, because that's what their incentives push them to do. You could do this for lots of other equilibria and lots of other mechanisms, including ones in the paper. We look at kind of 4 different things, not that specific one, but something called robust Bayesian truth theorem that has some similarities, and it has this same behavior. And so we kind of think that that's kind of a common thing to expect and worry about in these mechanisms, that kind of whenever people have richer information in their report, which seems kind of the natural thing in practice, we kind of expect kind of a sort of a small number of kind of stable decision points, and you could think about what mitigations might look like, be it getting more information, tailoring your payment rules to try to control this or get the decision rule where you want, or thinking about what voting rules, right? Like maybe if people are going to vote 50-50 and you don't want the outcome being 50-50, maybe you want a different voting rule, like you need a unanimous decision for it to go in favor of the company or something like that. So I'll wrap up there.
So this is a relatively old paper, 6-7 years old, I think. And it's possible that I'll miss some of the details related to this paper, so please feel free to ask clarifying questions. So the motivation for this paper was that what we observed was that in many real-world scenarios, information that we collect from agents is used to make some kind of decision in the future or to determine some kind of outcome. And the agents that are providing this information, they may have some external incentives to lie, to manipulate that outcome so that they can benefit from that. To give a specific motivating example, consider this service level agreement case in the case of web services, where the service provider can promise you that the service that they're providing will meet certain standards. So, for example, the response time of the service will be less than 2 seconds. And if the service does not meet that promise, then you may be entitled to some kind of refund. And this is just one example. There are other kinds of scenarios where similar situations arise. So, for example, if you're thinking about automated refund for delays of flights or trains or insurance industry, like resolving some kind of insurance claims and so on. But the fundamental question is, how do we know whether the agreement was violated or not? The traditional way to do it is to bring in some sort of trusted third party that would monitor the service and decide whether a violation occurred or not. And obviously in this room, I don't need to explain why that is not an ideal solution. The drawbacks are that it can be a costly solution. It assumes that the third party is trusted by everyone involved, and it's a centralized solution. So a fundamentally different system could be where we just ask the users themselves. So you use the service, tell us whether the service was as per the promise standard or not. And this is what we call as decentralized oracles. The challenging part here is that if you implement this kind of systems is that the users obviously have an incentive to not tell the truth. And we can call them outcome-dependent lying incentives. So in this specific example, because if I say that, well, the service was not bad, and if everybody says the service was, was not good, then as per the agreement, you may be entitled to some refund. So everybody has an incentive to say that the service was bad, even if it was good. So the question is it even possible to get truthful information from agents in this kind of setting when there are these kinds of outcome-dependent lying incentives? So let me make this more formal. So let's say the question specifically was the response time of service X less than 2 seconds? And you used all these users who are happy with the service, and let's say 47 out of 50 users said, yes, the service was good. And then there are 3 who said the service was bad. So what I call outcome for this question is exactly this fraction, that what fraction of the user said that the service was good and what fraction said the service was bad. And then the lying incentives, I just say there is a maximum amount K that everybody can get, multiplied by the fraction of people who said the service was bad. So in this case, K times 3 by 50 is the lying incentive, or is the refund that people get after the outcome is determined. There can be many different refund models. So one could be a generous refund model where everybody gets the refund regardless of whether they complained or not. And then there could be a more conservative refund model where only those who complain get the refund. I will focus on the generous one because that's the more interesting one from a technical perspective as well as I think from a practical perspective. What we observe here is that in both models, always reporting that the service was bad is the dominant strategy. And the contribution in this paper was that we showed that it's possible to get truthful information from agents, even in these kinds of settings with outside incentives. So specifically, we use this mechanism called the peer-to-peer theorem from crowdsourcing, from a paper by Radanovic, Yurka, and Paltings, published in 2016. So assume that the answer that an agent submitted for a question was Y, and then there is another agent that submitted an answer for the same question, and let's denote it by Y dash. So the payment rule in this mechanism is, it looks like something like this. If the answers match, Y and Y dash, then you pay the agent 1 minus P upon P, where P is the relative frequency of that answer Y in the answers collected for a priori similar questions. So this mechanism assumes that there are more than one question being resolved on the platform. Okay, it's not a single question mechanism. And if the answers don't match, then you charge the agent 1 unit, let's say. Now, to deal with these external lying incentives, you can just scale the payments with a positive constant alpha. So pay alpha times 1 minus P upon P if the answers match, and minus alpha otherwise. So we have some specific results on what should be that value of scaling constant to actually elicit truthful information. So assume that K is the maximum refund that anybody can get in this model. N is the number of agents who are participating in this outcome determination process. And delta, so this is an interesting quantity. It's an estimate of what we call the self-predictor value. Basically, intuitively, it's a correlation strength between an agent's and her peers' observations. So its value is higher if the agents believe that the quality of service is more homogeneous. So everybody is more likely to observe similar kind of service than we say the self-predictor value is high. Okay, so there is a more mathematical expression for it, but I've skipped it. And the theorem says that for a given delta and a scaling constant that is greater than K upon N times delta, the strategy profile, the truth-telling strategy profile is a strict equilibrium even if you underestimate delta. So you don't know the exact value of the self-predictor value, right? So we don't know what is the exact correlation strength. You can only estimate it. So even if you underestimate it, it's in a strict equilibrium. And if you overestimate it, even then it's an approximate equilibrium truth-telling. So relative saving, we define relative saving in this way. So it's basically the amount of total money that the platform has to pay if no side payment scheme is implemented, minus if you implement the side payment scheme, then what is the total payment divided by the total refund when there is no side payment scheme. So the optimal relative saving that we are chasing here is that if we hypothetically assume that if all agents turned honest and they reported truthfully, even just ignoring the rational strategy, then we say that, well, the platform can make up to a saving of up to the probability of a random observation being a good observation. So a random person saying that the service was good. Now we are come to real world where agents are not just honest, they are rational, and we have introduced this peer-to-peer theorem mechanism to induce truth-telling. Now what is the amount of relative saving that we can make? And we have a theorem about that. But the interesting thing is that this relative saving is always positive. So you're guaranteed to always pay less if if the number of agents that are participating in the process is above a certain threshold. And you can also show that this approaches the relative saving that we were chasing in the hypothetical case as this number of agents grows unbounded. Now, obviously, the elephant in the room, which is the other equilibria, so when you introduce truth telling, when you introduce this PTSD mechanism, denial strategy that is always saying bad service, regardless of the actual observation, it's no longer the dominant strategy, but it's still one of the equilibrium strategies. And the good thing is that you can eliminate that as well using Pietro's theorem. If you assume that all agents believe, all agents believe, you don't need to know which of these agents are honest agents, but if you assume that all the agents believe that there are some fraction of agents on the platform that will behave honestly, and then the remaining, let's say, fraction are adopting the denial strategy, and you have a scaling constant that satisfies certain condition, then you can show that you can eliminate that denial strategy equilibrium as well. We did some numerical experiments, which I'll skip. So the summary is that in real world, often agents have some kind of external incentives to manipulate the outcome from that is determined from an aggregate of the information that is reported by them. And we show that you can use a peer prediction mechanism, specifically this Pietro's theorem mechanism, with an appropriate scaling constant to guarantee truth telling. And you can actually approach really, optimal savings if the number of agents is sufficiently high. We also showed how to implement these kinds of mechanisms in a blockchain setting using Ethereum smart contract, which is a different paper, which I'm not talking about, but you can find that on my website if you're interested. Some of the other papers that I think could be quite interesting to this audience that I'm recently working on is recently we explored how to implement these kinds of mechanisms in large language models if you want to elicit more truthful information, not from humans, but from language models. And also how to aggregate different preferences when you're, let's say, using this kind of information elicitation to align AI with using human feedback. Thank you.
So now we have some time for kind of a roundtable discussion where we discuss Max philosophical ideas. Of course, we also take audience questions. So just to get my panelists opinions, to start off, how do you feel about so I think all the mechanisms we've described so far was designed for binary choices. What do you feel like the challenges are for non-binary choices? I feel a lot in Kleros, we're wrestling with these interesting overlaps between peer prediction and social choice theory because we have vote splitting can create particularly malicious effects in a decentralized environment. And I'm curious how you think about designing mechanisms coming from more of a peer prediction background in their voting process.
Yeah, I think non-binary settings are where you start to see these differences between mechanisms, right? So there are lots of different mechanisms. Output agreement, Pietro's theorem, then there's the dissect and Goel correlated agreement mechanism from David Park's groups. The assumptions under which these mechanisms work or do not work, I think they're kind of similar in binary settings, but it's really the non-binary settings where some mechanisms may be suitable for some setting, whereas not for the other one. So, but there are solutions. It's just that the assumptions differ in binary and non-binary settings.
And I think one thing that some of these do is make sense in some peer prediction settings and may or may not make sense for practical reasons here is, right, they try to leverage information across across tasks to give good incentives, right? So if you have, like, one advantage actually having lots of outcomes is that kind of lazy strategies like always choose the same thing start getting kind of a lot easier to detect or kind of show up. So you can do things like, well, yeah, if your report is always just agreeing with your report on some other task, that's probably not a positive sign. So you can, you know, give some of these incentives to avoid laziness with them. But the downside is then you have to be locking up people's money for longer periods of time to be able to do this. So there's certainly practical headaches with some of these approaches. And the other thing to say is, you know, the question is like, what is the relationship among these things? Or are they truly like just categorical, no relationship among them? Or is there some sort of, you know, order or hierarchy among them, in which case, you know, you start, you know, maybe you can, you know, do nice things with that relationship. But again, yeah, all of the pieces, right, the payments, the voting rules, all of these things have to kind of work together. It's all much more complex whenever you move beyond the binary world.
Yeah, the point about having mechanisms where you look at people over like many different tasks is interesting. I feel like one of the reasons we haven't seen so much of that in the blockchain space so far is that because the identity systems are so bad, like, sure, you can create a mechanism where you have to use the same address every time and you do like lots of tasks, but like, you know, if it's in the interest of the user to do that, they will. But like, nothing prevents them from creating another address and like trying to like, you know, come in and out of the different tasks and like, you know, like you, to the degree that you can do that with like identity systems that existed before, it's like rigid and awkward. And now, you know, I'm curious to see as like the identity mechanisms get better, whether that will open up somewhat the sort of playbook for new. I have other questions that I can ask the panel, but I think we started a bit late. Are there audience questions?
So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of soft identity in the sense of rep.
Sorry.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on kind of soft identity in the context of development of reputation in repeat games, because I see it as potentially a middle ground between hard doxing, you know, real identities, but over time, a unique, durable network identity can itself, the performance of it in, you know, both dispute resolution as well as other contexts can be transparent and measurable and might be a potential middle ground in these contexts, but it does require kind of repeat games to develop that said reputation.
Either of you want to?
Yeah. So so these mechanisms are, although there are relations between these incentive mechanisms and the reputation mechanisms, but specifically, I think at least the work that I presented, peer to serum and all, they don't assume these kinds of repeated interaction settings. So these are all single shot kind of settings. So they work. I think the only identity requirement there is that when you are collecting answers about others, you assume that you know, they are really about others and not your one agent's answers are not mixed in these others' answers. So I think that's the small identity requirement as far as I understand. For reputation systems, yes, you need more stronger identity systems there.
Yeah, I'd say there's kind of an older literature on this, like on these like sort of whitewashing attacks, right, where you have the option of keeping your kind of more durable identity or kind of, yeah, ditching it and coming back with a new one. And kind of my takeaway from that is that most of the solutions I've seen for how do you make things work in this sort of world basically boil down to treating newcomers badly, at least in a relative sense, right? And so that's kind of right. So you could imagine coming up with richer versions of some of these payment rules that where the payment you get out of the system, the size of the deposit you have to put up, whatever, are in some way related to kind of the strength of the identity you're bringing in. So I would imagine there's probably room to kind of innovate along those dimensions.
Just in terms of what we've like been applying with Kleros and like how we've thought about what we've deployed so far, like I would say that we've been a little skeptical of having like reputation systems that are too like very complex. Like have the like, kind of Web 2 style, like some AI is like running some kind of reputation algorithm on you, because like the more complex your system it is, the harder it is to analyze. And as a result, because the attack world is so hostile, we've had more of a tendency to like want mechanisms that have like very clear attack models, so we can say with it there, okay, like the attacker is only going to be able to attack the system if they have these criteria. So you don't want to have something that's too complex that like maybe the attacker hasn't like to be clever. They have lots of resources, they can figure out some way to get around and stuff. But certainly as you have better identities tools, relating to one of the later panels today, where it's harder for the attacker. The attacker has less of a manipulation space because they can't get multiple addresses on Truth Humanity or whatever. Maybe you don't have to be so afraid of that.
I have a question. I don't know if there's an answer, but I'd like your opinion on this. So when we try to apply these systems to real life cases in Kleros, so at some point we face, okay, we want this to use identity or not, or what is the right deposit for people to make? What do you think about what are the trade-offs involved in this? Let's say you want more accuracy, but what do you need to do in order to do that? Increase the deposit? What are the variables that are like a trade-off here in these decisions?
Yeah, so the computational literature has thought kind of a fair bit about this question of giving people incentives to exert effort and come up with good informed opinions and not just these kind of low effort, whatever my first reaction, or vote based on like what the first letter of the document is, or some simple things like that. And that has been the motivation for a lot of these kind of multitask ones. So like the dissect to Gauche one that I think we both mentioned, is an explicit reaction to that, but it does rely on there being kind of multiple tasks to be able to do it, right? So like a lot of it seems to be around either, tying up the money longer to be able to use this, or kind of generically raising the stakes. You can to the extent that there is some incentive to exert effort, you can kind of crank that up by just raising the stakes for people, but that obviously has its own consequences.
Yeah, and I also think that so it's obviously an important question about identity. But I also think that sometimes it's possible to push the guarantees a bit, even in this kind of settings where you don't have clear identity systems. So, for example, I was talking about this elimination of denialist strategy, when you assume that agents just believe that there exists some honest agents, and possibly the mechanism does not know which these honest agents are. So just the beliefs, if you can model the beliefs of the agents and use that to push the guarantees a bit. But obviously there is a limit to what you can do. And sometimes, yes, the guarantees do break if there is some sort of coordinated attack against it. Yeah.
I have a follow-up question, but I will let if there is another question, I will let you ask. No. So this is more for you, William. So can you explain a bit what are the, thought process when you calculate parameters for different types of cases? What are the variables that you consider, and how you go about with that?
Yeah. So So the way parameters are determined in Kleros as it exists is that we have a decentralized governance process. Like Kleros, in addition to being a protocol, is also a DAO, decentralized autonomous organization, where people like vote on parameters. They can be proposed by anyone in the community, and then like people like sort of participants in the protocol like vote on them. In practice, anyone in the community that's proposing the parameters winds up being me. And that I have like, we have a forum, you can propose stuff, it winds up being the person who proposes things. Not because it's like limited to me, but because I'm sort of I'm the one that's like working on this full time, so I have that incentive to do it. But we have like a calculator that suggests people's parameters. It's open, like I've published this so that other people can use it too. And the basic inputs into the calculator are like, how hard do you think this task is? Like, how much of my time do you think this takes? And questions about like, how good are the lazy strategies? If I just like vote for the same answer all the time, like how likely will that be to, be right? What percentage of the time? If I put in more or less effort, like what kinds of percentages of correctness will that get me? It outputs like a fee and a deposit that try to incentivize honest participation and disincentivize we're always voting for the same answer. And as we get better mechanisms or even just better models of how our participants act, like maybe, you can improve upon this process and come up with like better ways of generating this.
Any question from anyone? Thank you for the great panel then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Far be it for me to stand in the way of lunch, but I do think Oracle problems, and a lot of this is me indexing on these fascinating titles on the slide right here, but there are objectively verifiable things, such as what temperature it was, and questions like that. And then there are issues that require kind of, and I dislike the term subjective, but human judgment and fairness up there is what in particular is, it's context specific, but often revealed in real time, which is ex ante. We don't know what is fair given the complexity of human behavior that can emerge in particular situations. And so I'm curious as to any of the panelists' thoughts about parsing between revealing objectively verifiable, questions, numerical movements in cryptocurrency prices, et cetera, versus things that require kind of a dispositive human conclusion. And I am foreshadowing my own talk this afternoon, but it seems like these mechanisms have both promise and limitations with respect to those two classes of information.
Yeah. So like, that's certainly true that like different Oracle questions can be more or less subjective, require more or less effort. The thing for the like consensus algorithm is if you're in a truly decentralized space, like, yeah, okay, like you can objectively verify what the temperature is, but the consensus algorithm doesn't know that. So from the consensus algorithm point of view, like like the block producers that are following the, the Ethereum mining algorithm or whatever, the Ethereum block production algorithm, like you need, everything is subjective from its perspective. But in terms of what kind of mechanism you should design to like account for the fact that, from the humans that are answering the questions, they're going to put in more or less work. They're going to like be right more, or less frequently based on the effort they put in. It makes sense to use different mechanisms. Kleros has been designed to be sort of more for subjective questions that require human effort. There are many other blockchain oracles that exist sort of in the space of crypto land, which are more designed for objective questions. Where people are basically running a bot. It's like humans are like in Kleros, we expect human beings mostly to be the jurors. We're going to talk about AI jurors a little bit later in one of the panels. There are oracles, like Chainlink and, and others that are based on the assumption that like nobody's actually going to be like clicking a button physically. It's going to be a bot.
If you want to discuss oracles, you can ask this guy, your oracle guy.
Did the panelists have anything to add?
Yeah, I think in many of the mechanisms, like these peer prediction mechanisms, so for example, in this peer truth serum mechanism, we have this delta value, the self-predictor value, and as I said, this is the correlation strength between an agent's answer observation and the peer's observation. And if you see other mechanisms, they also have similar kind of quantities there. So the simplest one, output agreement, for example, if you take, you can say that, well, that works only in the setting when, the answers are very homogeneous or objective answers. Whereas as you move towards more complex mechanisms, for example, like the peer-truth theorem mechanism, that assumption is not there. But yes, you need to have this kind of, somehow an estimate of what is the correlation strength between different answers of different agents.
And also like the kind of concern I was raising about, right, kind of this richer information, right, kind of the more subjective the judgment is, the more bite that concern has, right? If it's a very objective thing, then like, if you look at it and come to a conclusion, you can be relatively confident that others came to that same conclusion. You don't need to worry too much about, the close call case. Whereas the world where, I would imagine most of the things that are coming to a dispute, they're coming to a dispute in need of resolution because they're not so clear cut, right? Either the facts are not clear or the rules by which the facts are supposed to be interpreted are not clear. And that's why these kind of borderline cases are probably something to worry about.
Yeah, and I mean, that's true even in mechanisms that were designed for very objective cases. Like there's an early crypto project called Ogre that was designed for prediction markets that had mechanisms in many ways similar to Kleros, and all of their voting was around what was the right answer to this thing people were betting on. But you're answering it after the fact, so you should know the answer, right? And they just got boiled down in weird rules arguing over edge cases. There was this one case that I think it was the one that got escalated the most ever on the platform and had tremendous amounts of money at stake over whether or not the weather was nice for a parade in France on Bastille Day. Just because the question was so poorly defined that it broke down into this massive community civil war over the language. So I mean, the thing with disputes is that the disputes that are going to really matter are the ones that wind up being controversial, even if the rules were supposed to be clear in advance. Yeah, thank you.